First up,
Yes, I would ask you to speak as loudly as you can, but I can't hear you.
Okay, you're going to be sworn in here, Doug.
Would you please spell your name?
My first name is Douglas, D-O-U-G-L-A-S. Last name Wolfberg, W-O-L-F-B-E-R-G.
Okay, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth?
Yes.
Proceed.
Doug, can you hear me?
Yes. Faintly.
Should I stand by the phone?
it might be better if you did.
Do it.
If I stand here, can you hear me better?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear now.
Okay. For the record, would you please state your name?
Douglas Wolfberg.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a consultant and attorney.
And what type of consulting do you do?
Emergency medical services, consulting and compliance work.
Could you give us a little background on your qualifications to do consulting on this type of work?
Sure. I originally became an emergency medical technician in 1981, and for most of the next 15 years worked in the field as an emergency medical service provider. Then, after graduating from college at Penn State with a bachelor's in health administration, worked as a county EMS director in Pennsylvania, and also then as a director of a 3-county regional EMS system. Then as an administrator for the statewide EMS council here in Pennsylvania, and then finally worked as a EMS consultant for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And then after that position, I enrolled in law school, finished my law degree in 1996, and for most of the time since then, except for a few years when I was practicing at another firm, I have been a principal in the firm of Page, Wolfberg, and Worth, whose practice is focused solely on ambulance and emergency medical service issues.
Were you contacted by the city of Clinton to assist them in a case involving ambulance billing records?
Yes.
How did you get contacted?
I was originally approached by a member of that department, who then put me in touch with counsel for the city, Mr. Walker, and then the first substantive contact I had about the case was through Mike Walker.
And who had originally contacted you?
I don't remember exactly, but one of the members of the department approached me at a conference last year after the case, I think, had been filed, and I was speaking at a conference in Iowa, and someone came up to me, it might have been Andy McGovern, I'm not 100% certain, and mentioned the case, and said if I was interested in assisting, they would have Mike Walker contact me. I said, sure, have him call me, and then the next contact I had was from Mike Walker.
And when you mentioned the case, is that the Schulteis versus City of Clinton case?
Yes.
What did you do? I assume Mike Walker called you.
Yes.
And what did he ask you to do?
Well, he asked us to review the pleadings. So the case file was sent to me, including the pleadings and just related court documents, which there was not much. It wasn't too voluminous in the way of pleading. And then he asked me to review records, ambulance records, and insurance records that were at issue in the case, to give my opinion about whether or not I thought the city had a defensible position in the Schulteis litigation.
And what did you review then specifically?
Well, I was sent over a period of some weeks. I was sent a few different CDs that had been prepared by Mr. Walker's office, and those CDs contained files of both patient care reports, which are the ambulance run charts, and some insurance documentation generated after the claim is submitted and paid. Documents like EOBs, which is explanation of benefits, or remittance notice. Documents that come from the insurance companies that say what was paid or not paid, how much was paid. So the CDs contained a mixture of ambulance patient care reports as well as insurance records.
And what specifically were you looking for in reviewing these documents?
Well, I was primarily looking to see if the documentation supported the level of service that was being billed on the insurance claims. That, you know, the Schulteis complaint was a federal False Claims Act case. So obviously, the central question in the case was, were the claims that were submitted on behalf of the city, were they justified? Did the documentation, primarily the ambulance call reports, support the services that they were billing for? And my job, I was asked to look at that documentation to see if the charts consistently supported what was being billed.
And what did you find when you reviewed these records?
Well, shortly into my review, I found something that was unusual. And what that was that as I began to review the charts and correlate the documents to a summary that had been prepared by Mr. Walker's office, that summary I was really using as a roadmap to try to just help me locate on which disk and in which file the documents were. So I was just using it to, you know, this document is in this file and that document is in another file. So using it to make sure I had all the documents in front of me. And I was retrieving them all from the right place. When I started to do that, I found that the calls that I was looking at had two different patient care reports for each call. And at first I thought maybe that was an anomaly, so I reviewed a few more claims and found out that that was consistently coming up, that there were two different versions of those patient care reports for the calls that I was looking at. And that was an unusual finding, and that was the very first thing that jumped out at me. And frankly, I didn't get much deeper in my review once that initial problem cropped up.
What did the differences in the patient care reports or the duplication, what did that indicate to you?
Well, it indicated to me that the patient care reports had been changed, and there, you know, the versions of those patient care reports were different. So at some point along the line, you know, somebody had to change some of what was contained on those charts to produce the two different versions I was seeing.
Do you recall what had been changed?
Sorry?
Do you recall what things you saw that had been changed?
The primary areas of change on the forms that I looked at seem to center around the nature of the dispatch information, the documentation of how the call was dispatched by the 911 center seemed to be the areas where most of the changes were made.
And what were the discrepancies that you saw?
One version of the chart generally seemed to have a condition that was stated more seriously than the other version of the chart. To give one example, one version of the chart might say that the dispatched condition of the patient was sick person or weakness, and the second version of that same patient care report might say chest pain or shortness of breath, both which would be treated more seriously than the other conditions that were reported.
Now, you do this on a regular basis, you review records,
Yes.
and do you see this often?
No.
How often have you seen it?
I would say rarely. I would say, you know, if I do, you know, if I look at, if I work with, you know, 30 clients in the course of a year doing chart reviews, I may see this once a year, once every 2 years.
After discovering this, you said you didn't get very far into it. How far did you get into it?
Well, I looked at about 60 charts from the CDs that I was given, that this was some kind of anomaly or that it was just bad luck of the draw that the first few charts I looked at happened to have different versions of the charts. And sometimes there are explainable reasons for that, and I wanted to just make sure that this wasn't an anomaly. And I wanted to look at enough charts to tell me whether this was an anomaly or whether it was a pattern. And I was satisfied that it was a pattern and not an anomaly. So my next move was then to contact Mike Walker and share with him those findings.
And how were you satisfied that this was a pattern and not an anomaly?
If it was an anomaly, I'd only expect to see it on a few charts, a handful of charts, if that. Every chart I pulled up randomly had, two different versions of the patient care report. So that would be more than just chance. That would lead you to that kind of finding. When selecting the claims randomly, if it was an anomaly, you wouldn't expect to see the same pattern come up in every randomly selected chart.
And did this come up in all 60?
I can't say all, but I would say the overwhelming majority.
How do you define overwhelming majority?
It would be 90%.
After talking to Mike Walker, what did you do next?
Well, when I told Mike that I was concerned that the two different versions of the patient care reports existed, and that one version stated the dispatched condition more seriously than the other version, I expressed my concern that was potentially consistent with the theory of liability raised in the Schulteis complaint. In other words, so far I can't offer a defense because the documentation seems to be consistent with the complaint. Now, because there can be other legitimate explanations for why you might see this, it's unusual, but I certainly did not want to discount the possibility that there were legitimate explanations for it. So I expressed my concerns to Mike Walker, and he asked me to contact Andy McGovern at the Clinton Fire Department.
And did you contact Andy?
I did.
And was he able to offer an explanation?
He offered, the first explanation he offered was that he told me that recently the department had upgraded its software to be what's called NEMSIS compliant. And we talked a little bit about that. And I'm familiar with NEMSIS. I've done some work for the NEMSIS organization, actually. It's a standard that's been developed by the federal government. And
I'm not familiar with NEMSIS. Tell me what that's about.
Sure, yeah. NEMSIS is the National EMS Information System, and it was a system put together under a contract with the federal government with an agency called NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And what NEMSIS was a standardized data set to try to uniformly collect and report pre-hospital data, so that you could make meaningful comparisons of data between counties, states, geographic areas, but the data would all mean the same thing because each state and locality collects data their own way. NEMSIS is a project by the federal government to standardize EMS data collection. And in fact, me personally and our firm were engaged by NEMSIS to advise them. So the reason I tell you that is just to tell you that I'm familiar with NEMSIS, and when that was offered as a potential reason why there might be different versions of the chart, I was a little skeptical, and I questioned Andy a little bit further, Mr. McGovern, about that a little bit further, just because it didn't strike me as something that would cause two different versions of the same chart to appear.
Why do you say that?
Well, I say that because NEMSIS is merely a data set. It can't change the value that you would see in a given field. One analogy, and I don't mean to speak beyond my expertise, I'm not a computer expert, but I guess one analogy that I could give was that if Microsoft upgraded the version of Excel spreadsheet that you use on your computer, and you opened a file that you created on the old version of Excel, it wouldn't change the values that you put into the database to begin with. It would merely change the operation of the software. And what I was seeing on the versions of the patient care reports were wholly different Nemesis does not do that. That's not how Nemesis operates. That the software would not go in and change the values that were entered into the database to begin with.
And when you say the value, is that a code you're talking about?
No, the value just means what somebody put into the box. What somebody wrote, shortness of breath, or chest pain, or weakness. Software would not go in and reassign the input or the contents of that field because it thinks it knows a better term. Software upgrading to be Nemesis compliant would not change the value of what's in that field. It would change the answers that were given when the software was, when the data was first entered.
So it wasn't a code that was changed, it was actual words that had been changed?
One of the two versions of many of the patient care reports I looked at did have codes in them. The usual pattern was that one version did not and one version did. And not only would there be a code on one of the versions, but there would be a different description of the condition that went along with that code.
And did Mr. McGovern offer any other explanations other than the switch in computer software?
Not jump to mind, not that I can recall offhand.
Was he familiar with these documents?
Which document?
Well, the 60 records that you reviewed, when you talked to him, was he familiar with what you were talking about?
I can't answer that because I didn't share with him the specific identity of the 60 charts that I was looking at. I simply said that there was a pattern of cases that I pulled up that had two different versions of the patient care report. And could he offer some explanation as to why I might be seeing those two different documents? So I did not review the specific 60 charts with him.
After talking with Mr. McGovern, then what did you do next?
I reported back to Mike Walker.
And what was that report?
This would have been a phone conversation, and I told him that I spoke with Andy as I was asked to, and that there was no good explanation for why two different versions of the charts existed in the file.
And that change, what would that represent as far as ambulance billing goes?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Well, why was it significant that there was a change?
Oh, well, the concern that I had, and keep in mind, I didn't know what document was the original and what was the changed document, so what sequence the two documents were generated, I have no way of knowing. But what my concern was that if the first version of the patient care report had a relatively benign condition logged as the reason for the dispatch, say weakness, and the second modified version was being made to look more serious, such as chest pain or shortness of breath, that the effect of that change could be to lead the city to have submitted claims inappropriately at a higher level. And by higher, I mean an advanced life support level, which pays more, has higher reimbursement than a BLS or basic life support level. If those conditions were being purposely made to look more serious, the result could have been that it would cause bills to be submitted at a higher level than what was justified, and that was my main concern.
So from your review, one of the records indicated a basic life support, or BLS claim, and the other record would indicate an ALS, advanced life support claim?
In some of the cases, both versions of the record supported an advanced life support response, but in some of them, the differences in records would have led, one would have been BLS, one would have been ALS, that's right.
And was that the majority of those? The difference would be the difference between ALS and BLS?
I can't recall if I could classify it as a majority.
And then after talking to Mr. Walker, what was your next action?
Not much. My involvement in the case pretty much started to wind down at that point. Once the discrepancy or the two different versions of the charts were discovered, there were then settlement discussions. I don't know if it was a result of that finding or not. I don't want to imply that it was. But the next thing that happened in the case is that there were settlement discussions. I was informed that those discussions were going to take place. And then I think that how I found out that there was a settlement is that one of my employees sent me a link to an article in the media talking about the settlement. So my involvement after bringing that issue to Mr. Walker's attention started to pretty much wind down at that point.
Did you ever look at any actual bills?
No, I did not. The claims, the actual claim files that were sent to the insurers were not presented to me for my review.
And you weren't asked to provide any opinion as to misconduct on anyone's part?
No, I was not. Nor should I add, do I have an opinion on misconduct on anybody's part, anybody individually.
Was it your understanding that Andy McGovern was the person in charge of ambulance billing, or as far as ambulance record keeping in the fire department?
No, I can't say that it was. I think my understanding was that Andy oversaw EMS. I did not know one way or another whether he was specifically charged with overseeing the records.
I have nothing further for you this time. I think you'll have some other people question you. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Mr. Fry.
Mr. Wolfberg?
Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
You did not, in your investigation, develop any opinion about whether the city of Clinton had knowingly or recklessly submitted false claims. Is that correct?
That's fair. I mean, those are legal conclusions, and I certainly was not in a position to draw a legal conclusion about documents that I saw.
Were there possible defenses in this case?
Yes.
And can you just talk about what some of those defenses might be?
Well, sure. I mean, in a federal False Claims Act case, there are a number of both procedural and substantive defenses. Procedurally, sometimes the information that forms the basis of a false claim lawsuit are based on things that were already publicly known. It's called the public disclosure bar that serves to bar lawsuits that are based on prior disclosed facts. So the public disclosure bar is one defense. Certainly, if there were mistakes made, mere mistakes do not constitute false claims, and a legal defense would always exist that the submission of claims, if they were improper, didn't rise to the level of knowingly filing false claims or filing those claims recklessly in disregard of whether they were true or not. Those are legal defenses, and there are substantive defenses. One of the ones that I shared with Mr. Walker was a defense on the issue of damages, and that is that if it was proven that some of these claims were what we would call upcoded or upgraded from BLS to ALS, my review of the documentation still showed that they were overwhelmingly medically necessary services entirety of the claims were improper. So if one service, the ALS fee was $350 and the DLS fee was $275, you'd be looking at a difference of $75 and not paying back the whole $350. So I think there was also some substantive defense just on mitigating the damages that the relator was claiming in the case.
And when you spoke to Mr. McGovern, he did offer an explanation. I believe you said that he didn't actually see any of the documents that you were looking at. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So he wasn't able to take one report and compare it to another and look at the point in time when it was generated and make those kinds of inquiries about the documents that you were looking at.
That's correct. I mean, to my recollection, I did not share specifics with him. I did that with Mike Walker, but I did not do that with Andy.
Now, I believe you said that you are not a computer expert.
I did say that, and I will repeat it. I'm not a computer expert.
Thank you. I am not either. But Andy's explanation that some of the issues that you saw might have been the result of some sort of a computer problem or issue. You were speaking as a layman then, not as an expert, in that you didn't find them persuasive.
That's correct.
You did not yourself make any inquiry of any computer experts to determine if there might be a basis for Mr. McGovern's at least suspicion at that time that it could have been computer generated.
That's correct.
And you did not contact Firehouse Software specifically and ask them if there could be any kind of a reason that would explain Andy's suspicions about the difference between the two records.
That's correct.
I've heard the term limited text field. Does that mean anything to you?
I've heard of it. It means to me probably as much as it means to any other layperson that in some cases data can be exported into fields that can be used by other software or other programs, and I believe that's one of the ways that data are exported, but that's my way of understanding of it.
You're not really sure then what that means or what its limitations might be.
No, I don't want to try to sound any smarter than I am, which is not very, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, from your background, it sounds like you're pretty smart.
Thanks.
From what you've testified to, I would surmise that you would characterize your investigation as being in its preliminary stages.
I would probably I would like to take a little bit of issue with the question. My role was really not to be the investigator. My role was to review the records and offer an opinion on the defensibility of the claim or of the lawsuit. I was asked to speak with Mr. McGovern to see if there was any, operational reason why there were two different versions of the chart. To the extent you want to call that an investigation, that was the limit of my investigation.
Okay. You mentioned that there might be some explainable reasons for the differences between the two reports.
There could be.
And you didn't rule out, but still the possibility that there might be some explainable reasons for the differences. Is that fair?
Are we talking about before or after my conversation with Mr. McGovern?
After your conversations with Andy.
After my conversation with Mr. McGovern, I was less convinced that there was a valid reason, that there was an explainable reason for two different versions of the charts.
But in order to rule that out, you would need to do some further investigation or consultation with computer experts, wouldn't you?
Somebody would. I wasn't the investigator in the case.
Right.
I suppose to exhaust that possibility, that would be a necessary step, sure.
Okay. would you expect a person who has received EMT or paramedic training to be expert on ambulance billing matters?
Not simply by virtue of receiving EMT or paramedic training,
And why is that?
because it's not covered in EMT and paramedic training.
There was some mention of a percentage of anticipated ALS calls as compared to BLS. And have you mentioned a rule of thumb in that regard?
That hasn't come up while I've been on the phone here with you folks today, so if it came up at another part of the hearing, I'll take your word for that.
Did you discuss with either city employees or Mr. Walker a percentage?
I don't think I ever discussed it with city employees, but I seem to recall, yes, that there were some discussions that I had with Mr. Walker in general terms about percentages that you would expect to find of ALS to BLS.
You did not suggest to Mr. Walker that there couldn't be circumstances where particular departments might deviate from those general percentages?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Did you discuss with Mr. Walker whether or not there might be circumstances where particular ambulance services would deviate from those percentages that you talked about?
I don't recall if we had that specific discussion.
Do you recall the percentage that you discussed?
I typically talk, the percentage I typically use when talking to people about that is that it's the ALS to BLS ratio is anywhere from 60-40 to 70-30, usually closer to 60-40.
But you would admit that there are circumstances where it might be higher?
Yes. Well, higher than 70 or higher than 60?
Higher than 70.
In my experience, it starts to become harder to plausibly defend rates that get higher than 70. I suppose it's possible. And I think it would primarily be driven by how the dispatch protocols were written in that jurisdiction.
Are you familiar with medical dispatch?
Yes.
What are the advantages of medical dispatch?
Well, as a concept, medical dispatch, or what we call medical priority dispatch, standardizes the process of call taking and then resource deployment, so that if a caller says, I have this condition, or it hurts here, or it doesn't feel well here, or I can't breathe, or whatever the complaint is, the dispatchers are trained to sort of standardize that into a card or a specific code of response, and then issue a consistent response that somebody who has this complaint or that complaint gets this response or that response. So it standardizes the process and removes guesswork from the dispatch side of EMS.
And in that event, there would be a record of the dispatch information, and also the paramedic would not have to make the decision as to what that dispatch information, or how that dispatch information would be classified.
Well, there's couple different parts of that question, and there should be, to answer the first part of that question, there should be a record of the dispatch. In fact, that was one of the things I asked Mr. McGovern in our phone conversation. Because if I was trying to reconcile which of the two versions of the patient care report was the correct one, obviously we need to reconcile the difference in type of dispatch. So one of my questions was to ask him, are there source documents? Are there records from the dispatch center? And I specifically asked, were there CAD records, which means computer-aided dispatch, and was told that there were not. So there was no ability to reconcile source documents with the patient care reports to determine what exactly did the dispatcher say when they dispatched you on this call. So all we had to go by was what was written on the patient care report. The second part of your question was implied that it was the paramedic who made the decision on what to write down on the dispatch information. There should be very little, if any, discretion on what the paramedic writes down. How you were dispatched is a fact, and that's something that should be objectively documented and not interpreted or spun. If the dispatcher said chest pain, that's what you should write down. If the dispatcher said weakness, that's what you should write down. When we're talking about the recording of the dispatch information on the patient care report, that should not be a discretionary or interpretive act on the part of the paramedic.
What is the ALS assessment rule?
Well, the ALS assessment rule from Medicare is that if a call is dispatched at the advanced life support or ALS level, and the ambulance service responds on an emergency basis, meaning it responds immediately, that if the patient's condition turns out to only on the condition on scene turns out to only require BLS or basic level interventions, that the call can still properly be billed as an ALS call based on the presence of the reported ALS condition at the time of dispatch plus the emergency response. So where the patient still needs a transport to a hospital but only requires BLS level intervention, when the call was originally reported as an ALS call at the time of dispatch, Medicare deems that ALS response to be justified and will allow the ambulance provider to bill at that ALS level.
Are there certifications for people who are doing coding for ambulance billing?
Yes.
Is there a specific certification for ambulance billing? And if so, when did that begin?
Yes. There is a certified ambulance coder designation, and that became available in April of 2009.
Before April of 2009, was there any coding certification that might be of advantage to a person doing ambulance billing?
Yes. One that comes to mind is the CPC designation, Certified Professional Coder, offered by the American Academy of Professional Coders.
And would that be something that a department who was doing billing for ambulances would perhaps be interested in?
Yes.
And why?
Because that training teaches. I am not a CPC, so I can't. I don't want to represent that I've been through that program. I've been through the CAC program, but those programs are generally designed to make a person think critically about the documentation that they're looking at, and to make sure that every code they report on a claim is justified, and that they're not billing based on assumptions, but they're billing based on hard documentation.
Would you expect people that were doing the billing to look at narrative reports and when they put codes on the bills?
Yes.
And to have the skills to interpret the narrative report?
Yes.
I'm kind of working in cramped space here, so give me a minute. During your involvement in the case, did you ever have a conversation with Fire Chief Mark Regenweather in Clinton?
Not that I can recall.
Did you ever give Mark Regenweather any information relating to your findings or discussions in this case?
No.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Mr. Supla, have you got any?
No, it'd be Mr. Doe.
Okay, Mr. Doe.
Mr. Wolfberg, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm again working in cramped space just as council was doing, so I apologize if I'm shuffling papers or anything. You indicated that you had no evidence or had formed no opinions with regard to any improprieties done by either Mr. McGovern or Mr. Reaganweather. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And your role in this was simply to review and assist Mr. Walker in potential defense of this case, correct?
Yes. Yeah, although that role was slightly expanded when I was asked to speak with Mr. McGovern to do somewhat of an investigation, but you correctly characterized my primary role.
Okay, and the documents that you primarily reviewed were the 60 or so documents related to the patient care reports?
Yes, and associated insurance records. And I want to be clear, it was 60. I couldn't tell if you said 60 or 16.
Right, 60.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And curiously, you indicated that one of the forms of the patient care reports had no codes on them. Is that correct?
That's what I seem to recall. It seemed to me that the pattern was that on one version there was simply a narrative description of a condition, and on the second version there was a description along with a code.
Okay. And was it your understanding that Mr. Schultheis's complaint in the federal lawsuit was that he was being asked to upgrade the codes that he was putting on patient care reports?
Without having gone back and looked at the complaint, it was my understanding that the information that people were changing or being asked to change information, I can't recall that it specifically alleged codes.
Okay. If Mr. Schultheis's complaint and testimony today was that he was asked to change codes but never to change the narrative reports, would that be contrary to what you were kind of examining and giving an opinion on?
I don't know that it would be contrary. When I was looking at the documents, I was concerned by the difference in the two versions of the patient care report. And if somebody was being asked simply to change codes, I'm not sure why one of the versions would have turned up without codes.
It doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, again, I don't have the charts in front of me, but I do recall some of them, one version having codes and one not. Whether or not it was the allegation of the complaint was that information was being changed or codes were being changed, I suppose the complaint would speak for itself, and the person who filed it, I suppose, did speak for himself. So I guess I probably shouldn't characterize it any further since I have not gone back and re-reviewed it.
Would you agree with me that Medicare and Medicaid billing rules are complicated?
Yes.
And you have a disclaimer in your seminar materials about that, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. And do you believe it is a reasonable solution for fire departments in cities the size of Clinton, Iowa, to outsource their billing responsibilities?
Sure. Many do.
And can you tell us why you think that's a reasonable solution?
Well, because there are companies out there that specialize in doing billing and that are, simply through economies of scale, have people who are pretty well trained and who can stay on top of the ever-changing rules a little bit better, perhaps, than one, or two people maybe in a department. I'm speaking generally here. I'm not speaking with specific reference to Clinton. And those companies, they do larger volumes of claims, so generally better equipped to handle, not better, they're well equipped to handle issues and, problems that would arise in the claims or billing process.
Can you give me or give us an example of some of the problems that arise in the billing process?
Oh, just generally, for example, a patient care report gets turned in and we don't have any insurance information on the patient. Some of the companies, the outsourced companies, the third-party billing companies that do this, have, subscriptions to some of the national databases that do skip tracing and can help find patients and get their insurance information, and do eligibility inquiries, and determine what coverages are available. And those resources are generally, they cost money, and you tend to see them more in larger billing operations than in smaller ones. But again, that's just one example, and that's only speaking in terms of generalities. Some smaller departments do subscribe to those services and do have access to them.
Do you believe that firefighter paramedics should be responsible for things such as modifiers and things of that nature on billing?
I do not.
And why is that?
Because modifier selection and procedure code selection and diagnosis code selection is itself a specialty, and that's why we have certified coders. And just as it's the job of an EMT or a paramedic to listen to patient complaints and then decide what the best course of action in mobilizing, treating, and transporting that patient may be, I wouldn't expect that EMT or paramedic to have the training or the knowledge to tell the coder what Medicare's definitions are between one level of service and another. Just as I wouldn't want the coder to come in and say, start an IV, use normal saline instead of, whatever. It's a specialty just as patient care is a specialty. And simply by virtue of being an EMT or a paramedic, you're not trained to understand coding.
Do you have an opinion with regard to whether or not the billing function is something that should be done by an office person?
Well, by definition, most billing is done in an office, so they're office people. So I'm not sure how to answer that other than to say that they are office or administrative people who do the billing. If what you mean is, I'll let you rephrase a different question.
I guess what I'm asking about is whether it should be done by somebody who is not a firefighter EMS or EMT.
Unless, I just want to be careful here, because there are cases where EMTs and paramedics who have, had on-the-job injuries and who have, gone into office or administrative positions have learned how to do billing and have gone into those kinds of positions. So with additional training, whether that's on the job or formalized training, EMTs and paramedics can do billing, just like a biller can learn to be an EMT. But being an EMT doesn't make you a biller, and being a biller doesn't make you an EMT. So with the additional training, I'm confident an EMT or paramedic could do billing, but they can't just because they're EMTs and paramedics.
Is there a distinction in your mind between the person who is the EMS director and the person who is the biller?
Is there a what? I'm sorry?
A distinction.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Typically, the EMS director is not the person who does the billing.
And why is that?
Because an EMS director, that's a general title, but generally when you speak of an EMS director, that person's responsible for staffing and for operations and for, making sure that equipment's being maintained, schedules are being met, that, trucks are being deployed where they're supposed to be, and, personnel hassles. And I've always thought of the EMS director as somebody who has, more global responsibility for operations as well as for management. And they would not be the person who sits down and does the billing. In some cases, EMS directors oversee the billing, but very few are immersed in the details of billing.
Is it your opinion that the person actually doing the billing needs to review the narrative report and the codes and the modifiers to make certain that they are correct?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because if the person who does the billing doesn't do that, I don't know who else will. And the Medicare and Medicaid and other insurers insist, rightfully so, that when you submit a claim that it's accurate.
And is that one of the reasons you testified that the biller is expected to have the skills necessary to interpret narrative reports?
Yes, that would be one of the reasons.
Did you have any follow-up with the IT person at the City of Clinton with regard to Mr. McGovern's explanation?
No.
And did you have any follow-up with regard to any server upgrades at the city of Clinton?
I'm sorry, follow up, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, we're cutting out a little bit, I'm sorry. Did you have any follow-up with anyone regarding server upgrades or updates at the city of Clinton and when those might have occurred?
No.
Hold on just a minute, let me see if there's any other questions I have.
Sure.
Did you have an opinion from your review whether or not the relator, Mr. Schultheis, overreached in his complaints in this case?
Do I have an opinion on whether the relator overreached?
Yes.
Yes, I guess based on my limited vantage point of just looking at documentation, there did not seem to be overreaching. The theory of liability in the complaint was plausible based on the documentation I saw.
Did you find from your review that there was medical necessity for the trips that you did review?
By and large, yes. I don't recall being being concerned about a medical necessity problem in the documentation. I thought most of the services merited transport to the hospital. Most of these patients needed ambulances, from what I remember. But my only, main concern was the dispatch documentation.
And were you aware or made aware that at least one of the specific allegations in the relator's complaint involved a situation where there was no bill?
Where there was no what? I'm sorry?
No bill.
No bill?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand that characterization, but
In other words, let me ask that a different way. Did Mr. Walker tell you that one of the specific examples in the federal complaint involved a situation where the city of Clinton did not bill for the service?
as I sit here today, I can't recall that, but I read the complaint, so if it's in the complaint, I would have seen it at the time I was doing the work.
What you would have seen was an allegation that the patient was billed, but did anyone ever tell you that that was inaccurate?
I don't have any specific recollection of that issue in the case, so no, I don't believe that anyone did.
Okay, that's all I have.
Any questions?
Mr. Super.
No, nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfberg.
Thank you.
Mr. Super.
I think we're going to take the witness out of order.
Is Kip Ireland here? Kip? There he is, good.
Mr. Ireland's being called, John, Mr. Ireland's being called on behalf of
Yes.
Mark.